Daniel Whitaker walked into the Ashford Logistics building at 7:47 on a Tuesday morning, 47 minutes late. His navy work jacket carried a dried streak of someone else's blood. Garrett Voss stood beside Caroline Ashford on the operations floor, in front of 40 workers. Caroline did not ask why. "Clear out your locker. Security will walk you out." Daniel looked at her. He did not argue. He did not explain. He unclipped his badge, set it on the nearest workbench, and walked toward the door. 2 hours earlier, he had saved her mother's life on a Savannah sidewalk. If a story like this matters to you, drop the city you're watching from in the comments. Stories travel further when people show up. The morning had started long before any of it. 5:20 in the Whitaker kitchen. Daniel cracked 2 eggs into a pan, toasted bread, and poured orange juice into a small blue cup with a chipped rim. Emma came down the stairs in socks, dragging her backpack by one strap. She was 8 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's careful quiet. "You forgot to braid my hair, Daddy." "I didn't forget. I was waiting for you." He sat her on the kitchen stool and worked her hair into 2 even braids while the eggs finished. He kissed the top of her head and zipped her jacket to the chin. At 6:15, Mrs. Ruth from next door waved at him through the kitchen window. She was 70 years old and had walked Emma to school every weekday morning for 3 years. Emma ran out and hugged her around the waist. Daniel watched until they turned the corner. He pulled on his Navy Ashford Logistics jacket and went out to the truck. The truck was a dark blue Ford F-150 from 2004. It had belonged to his father, Walter Whitaker, who had spent 32 years as a mechanic at the Savannah shipyard. Daniel had never been able to sell it. He pulled out of the driveway at 6:25. Across town, Caroline Ashford had been at her desk since 5:45. She drank her coffee black and stood at the office window watching the operations floor light up below her. Her father had built the company over 40 years. She had held the chair for 9 months. She had not yet stopped feeling like a guest in her own building. Garrett Voss came in at 6:50 with a tablet under his arm. "Whitaker isn't here. 3rd time this quarter." "How late?" 40 minutes and counting." Caroline did not answer right away. The quarterly board review had come back the week before with operating costs up 6%. She knew what the floor said about her behind her back. She knew, in the way only a daughter of a founder knows, that her last name was both her armor and her cage. Garrett's voice went lower. "The floor watches how you handle this." She watched the door. At 6:32, Daniel had passed the south end of Forsyth Park and seen a woman lying on her side on the sidewalk near a wrought iron bench. Her handbag was open beside her. Her phone was face down 10 feet away. 2 joggers ran past. One slowed for a second, then kept going. Daniel pulled the truck to the curb and left the engine running. He crossed the sidewalk in 4 strides and knelt beside her. She was unconscious. The left side of her mouth was slack. Her breathing was shallow but present. His hands moved on their own. He checked her pulse with 2 fingers below the jaw. He cleared her airway. He turned her onto her side, supporting her neck the way he had been trained to support a neck 1,000 times before. In a previous life he no longer talked about. He called 911 and gave the dispatcher the cross street, the woman's apparent age, the time of onset, the visible stroke signs. His voice did not shake. "Ma'am," he said, "stay with me. I'm right here. Help is coming." She did not open her eyes, but somewhere inside the fog she heard him. The ambulance arrived at 6:41. The lead paramedic, a man named Marshall, looked at the way Daniel had positioned her, then at Daniel. "You medical?" "Used to be." Marshall did not ask anything else. They loaded her into the back. Daniel followed in the truck the 6 minutes to Memorial Health and stood in the emergency department hallway, jacket cuff stained where her forehead had grazed his sleeve, until a nurse came out and told him the patient was stable. "You family?" "No." "You want to leave a name?" "She's stable. I need to get to work." It was 7:08 when he pulled out of the hospital lot. Inside the Ashford building, the clock on the operations floor read 7:45. Caroline stood near the central conveyor, with her hands folded behind her back. Garrett checked the time again. 2 minutes later, Daniel walked through the door. 40 workers turned their heads. Caroline did not look at the cuff. She did not see the blood. She saw only the time on the wall and the count of weeks since the cost overrun, and the eyes of a vice president who had told her this was the moment that would set the tone. After Daniel walked out, The floor did not return to its rhythm. Jerome, the foreman, stood for a moment with his clipboard pressed against his thigh, looking at the door Daniel had just walked through. In the corner, Helen Whitmore from Human Resources closed her eyes for one full second. 25 years earlier, Daniel had been 15 years old and lying on his back under the hull of a shrimp boat in his father's repair bay at the Savannah shipyard. Walter Whitaker passed him a wrench without looking down. "Hands that can fix an engine can fix anything, son." It was the only theory of life Walter ever offered out loud. Daniel had carried it for 30 years. He had been the quiet kind of student teachers remembered. Full scholarship to Emory University, another to Emory School of Medicine, residency at Grady Memorial Hospital, in the trauma bay of the busiest emergency department in the southeastern United States. By 34, he was an attending. By 37, he was chief of emergency medicine. The hospital had never had a younger one. He had married a Savannah girl named Sarah. They had a daughter and named her Emma. They lived in a small house in Atlanta with a porch swing Sarah had repainted twice. 3 years ago, Sarah had been driving on Interstate 85 when a freight truck crossed the line. Daniel had been on shift when the call came in. He had walked into his own emergency department and recognized his wife's shoes before he recognized her face. His team had worked on her for 11 minutes. He had stood at the foot of the bed, the chief of the department, the man with the steadiest hands in Georgia, and he had not been able to do anything that mattered. After the funeral, he had resigned. He had sold the house. He had moved back to Savannah because he wanted Emma to grow up on the same streets her mother had walked. He had applied for the maintenance job because his father had taught him that hands which could fix an engine could fix anything. When Helen Whitmore asked him in the interview why a man with his resume was applying to fix conveyor belts, he had said, "Because I need to work with my hands again. I'm good at fixing things. I always was." Helen had not pushed. She had kept the original application in the confidential section of the personnel database, where she filed things employees asked her to keep. That afternoon, she pulled up that file and read it once through. Then she picked up the phone. "Daniel, let me talk to her. I won't violate your privacy. I'll tell her I reviewed your file and found irregularities in Garrett's termination report. That's all true." She made the decision in 10 seconds, Helen. That tells you everything you need to know about whether more information would have helped. It tells me she didn't have the right information. It tells me she didn't ask. He thanked her and hung up. Daniel sat in the driveway for 10 minutes with both hands on the wheel, looking at the cuff of his jacket. He hoped the woman had children who would get to the hospital in time. Then he went inside and put on a pot of coffee. He did not yet know her name was Dorothy Ashford. Caroline Ashford's phone rang at 2:11 that afternoon. It was Memorial Health. Her mother had been admitted that morning following a transient ischemic attack on a sidewalk near Forsyth Park. Caroline drove to the hospital with her hands tight on the wheel and the city blurred at the edges of her vision. Dorothy was awake, pale, tired, but awake. Caroline took her hand and sat down hard in the chair beside the bed. The attending physician, Dr. Sutton, gave Caroline the rundown in the hallway. Someone stabilized her on scene within minutes, turned her, cleared her airway, kept her conscious. Whoever he was, he knew exactly what he was doing. The first few minutes are everything. Who was he? He didn't leave a name. White man, around 40, calm, drove a dark blue pickup truck, followed us here, waited until she was stable. Then he said he had to get to work. Caroline went back into the room. Dorothy reached for her hand again. He had the steadiest hands, baby. He kept telling me to stay with him. I couldn't open my eyes, but I could hear him the whole time. Caroline brought her mother's hand to her cheek and said nothing. By the second day after the firing, the B-line conveyor on the operations floor stopped. Daniel had built a relay modification on that conveyor 4 years ago, after the original control board had been discontinued. He had hand-sourced the replacement components from a surplus warehouse in Macon. He had drawn the new schematic in a notebook he kept in his locker. Without him, the system was a black box. Garrett brought in Allied Industrial Services on an emergency contract. Their first technician powered up Terminal 7 before checking the relay mod and fried the secondary control board. The repair estimate climbed to $23,000. The estimated downtime climbed to 4 days. That same evening, Daniel stood in his backyard with Emma, planting a row of sunflower seeds along the back fence. Emma pressed her thumb into the soil and counted holes out loud. "Are you going to a new job, Daddy?" "Not yet, sweetheart. I'm taking a few days." "Why?" He brushed a smear of dirt from her cheek. "Because some mornings a man has to slow down before he speeds up again." She accepted this the way 8-year-olds accept things from fathers they trust, and she pressed the next seed into the ground. Caroline stood at her office window at 9:30 that night and looked down at the parking lot, where the painted letters spelling D. Whitaker marked an empty space. Jerome found Caroline in the executive elevator at 4 o'clock the next afternoon. "Ma'am." "Jerome, I've been on that floor 22 years. That man missed one day in 3 years, when his daughter had a fever. Came back the next morning with the maintenance reports he'd written from home the night before. He wasn't late without a reason. He wasn't late, period. Until yesterday." Caroline looked at the panel of buttons. She did not look at Jerome. "I'll review the file." "You should, ma'am." She reviewed it that night. She pulled the original time clock records, not Garrett's summary. The first late arrival in the quarter had been 7 minutes. The system note read daughter ill, neighbor delayed. The second had been 4 minutes. The IT department had confirmed a card reader malfunction that morning. Neither incident met the threshold for a tardiness violation under the company's own policy. The third was the morning he had been fired. 47 minutes. No annotation. Helen cornered Caroline the next afternoon in the small conference room on the 3rd floor. "Caroline, when Garrett submitted Whitaker's file for the termination review, he used a summary, not the original application. The summary is incomplete. If you're reviewing this decision, you should see the original." "What's in the original?" Helen looked at her for a long second. "His previous experience. In full. The summary doesn't include any of it." "Why is it confidential?" he asked. "Not classified. Just private. A formal internal review request from the CEO overrides that. I can have it open for you in an hour." Caroline did not sign the request that night. She drove home and sat at her kitchen island and ate a piece of cold pizza standing up. She kept looking at the cuff of her own coat, hanging on the back of a chair, and seeing a different cuff in her memory. At 10 o'clock she got back in her car and drove past 814 East 38th Street without slowing down. The porch light was on. A dark blue pickup truck sat in the driveway. The kitchen window glowed yellow, and through it she could just make out the shape of a man standing at the counter and a small child sitting at a table. She did not stop. She drove home and lay awake until 2 in the morning. Inside that yellow window, Daniel was washing dishes. Emma sat at the kitchen table with a coloring book. "Daddy." "Yeah, sweetheart. Mrs. Ruth says you used to be a doctor." He kept his hands in the sink. He kept the water running. "That was a long time ago. Why don't you do it anymore?" He shut the tap off. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. "Because for a while, after Mama, I needed to do something else. Are you ever going to do it again?" He looked at her. The question had been sitting in his chest for 3 years, and his 8-year-old had just asked it out loud at a kitchen table on a Wednesday night. "I don't know yet." She nodded. She turned the page of the coloring book and held out a crayon. "You can color the sky. I'm tired of the sky." He took the crayon and started to color. By the end of the week, Dorothy was home. Caroline took 2 days of leave and stayed with her in the Isle of Hope house. She made tea and ignored emails and watched her mother sleep in the afternoon sunlight. Dorothy told her the story again over breakfast on Saturday morning. "He drove a dark blue pickup. Old. Early 2000s. He knelt down and checked my neck before he moved me. He turned me on my side so carefully, like he was afraid of breaking me. Then he stayed. He followed the ambulance. He waited until the nurse said I was stable. Why didn't he leave his name?" Dorothy looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Some people don't help because they want to be thanked, baby." Caroline nodded. She did not say anything for a while. She was already, without admitting it to herself, doing the math. The drive from the south end of Forsyth Park to Ashford Logistics was 14 minutes. No traffic. The drive from the park to Memorial Health was 6. If a person had stopped, taken 5 to 8 minutes to stabilize a stranger, waited the 9 minutes the dispatcher log said it had taken for the ambulance, followed to the hospital, waited 10 to 15 minutes for confirmation that the patient was stable, and then driven on to work, the total delay would have been somewhere between 44 and 52 minutes. 47 minutes sat exactly in the middle of that window. Caroline did not know what to do with the number. She knew only that the number existed, and that it made it harder to sleep. Garrett Voss could feel something shifting. He had been at Ashford Logistics for 15 years, the last 7 as vice president of operations. When the founder had announced his retirement, Garrett had expected the chair. He had been told, in private, and in language soft enough to pretend was not a refusal, that the family wanted family. Caroline had been brought in instead. Since then, Garrett had played a longer game. He had streamlined personnel reports. He had recommended the right departures and the right hires. He had moved certain maintenance contracts to Allied Industrial Services, a company partly owned by his sister's husband, Derek Voss. The commissions had not been small. Daniel Whitaker had been a problem because Daniel understood the floor better than Garrett did, and the floor knew it. Removing Daniel had been the cleanest opportunity Garrett had been handed in 2 years. He had been certain Caroline would not ask questions. Now he watched her review old time clock logs in the executive system, and he sent a quick internal memo to a board member named Raymond Holloway praising her decisiveness, and he authorized another Allied contract to replace a perfectly functional forklift battery system. He told himself he was not nervous. That Saturday afternoon, Caroline drove to 814 East 38th Street for the second time. This time she got out of the car. She stood on the porch for a moment, feeling stupid, and was about to leave when an older woman called from the porch next door. "Daniel? He's at the community center. Saturday afternoons. He's always there." Mrs. Ruth gave her the address with the easy generosity of someone who had decided long ago that Daniel Whitaker was worth trusting strangers with. Caroline got back in her car. Her hands sat on the wheel for 30 seconds before she turned the key. The Midtown Community Center was a low brick building, with a basketball court out front and a parking lot half full of older cars. Caroline parked across the street and walked in through glass double doors. A volunteer at the desk waved her down a hallway. She saw him through the window of a large multi-purpose room. Daniel was teaching a group of about 10 teenagers how to perform chest compressions on a CPR mannequin. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He moved among them, adjusting hand positions, demonstrating compression depth, his voice carrying just enough authority to fill the room without raising. He looked, in this light, like a man entirely at home in his own skill. Caroline watched from the hallway. Emma came running out of a side room, ponytail bouncing, a book held up over her head like a trophy. "Daddy, I finished the whole thing." Daniel turned, set down the dummy, and crouched to catch her as she launched into his arms. He spun her once and put her down gently and asked her which part she had liked best. The smile on his face was a different smile than any Caroline had seen from him in 3 years of his employment. Daniel looked up and saw her at the window. He sent Emma back to the reading room with a kiss on the top of her head and stepped out into the hallway. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked exactly the way he had looked when she had fired him, which was the part that bothered her most. "Miss Ashford." "Caroline." He inclined his head a half-inch in acknowledgement. "Jerome said I should talk to you before I closed your file." "Jerome talks too much." A small silence opened between them. She had not planned what she was going to say. She heard her own voice say it anyway. "Why didn't you tell me anything that morning?" Daniel looked at her. He took his time about it. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of a man who had been asked a question that had been answered, long ago, by something other than words. Would it have mattered? She did not answer. She could not, because the honest answer was no, and they both already knew that. He nodded once, as if she had answered out loud. "The floor's going to need someone who understands the B-line conveyor. Whoever Garrett brings in won't know about the relay mod I built into the control box. Tell them to check Terminal 7 before they power up. Otherwise, they'll fry the secondary board." They already did. He took that in. He did not say anything. He just nodded. She walked back out to the parking lot and stood beside her car. Across the row, parked between 2 beat-up sedans, was a dark blue Ford F-150 from the early 2000s, her mother's voice. He drove a dark blue pickup. Old. Early 2000s. Caroline put her hand on the roof of her own car to steady herself. She drove 4 blocks before pulling over. The volunteer at the front desk had handed her a folded flyer on the way out. She looked at it now. Saturday CPR certification taught by D. Whitaker, free of charge, underneath in smaller type. Daniel has been with the Midtown Center for 2.5 years. Donations welcome. 2.5 years. Saturdays. free of charge. She turned the flyer over. On the back, in handwritten ink, someone had scrawled a thank you note from a parent. "My daughter is alive because of what you taught her cousin last spring." Caroline sat in the parked car for 10 minutes before she could trust herself to drive. That night, Daniel made grilled cheese on the stove, and Emma told him about a girl at the community center who could already do compressions to the beat of a song he had taught the older kids. He did not mention the woman in the hallway. Emma, who noticed everything, did not ask. Monday morning at 7 o'clock, Caroline signed the formal internal review request and emailed it to Helen. By 8, Helen had the original file open on Caroline's monitor. Daniel Whitaker, M.D. Emory University School of Medicine, summa cum laude. Residency, Grady Memorial Hospital, Emergency Medicine. Board certification, Emergency Medicine. Previous position, Chief of Emergency Medicine, Grady Memorial Hospital, Atlanta, Georgia. Tenure, 3 years in role, 10 years on staff. Caroline read the paragraph through once, then twice. Then she sat back in her chair and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Helen, standing in the doorway, spoke quietly. "He told me he needed to work with his hands again. He said he was good at fixing things. He didn't want anyone treating him like the doctor he used to be. He just wanted to be a man at work. I respected that. I didn't tell anyone. He saved my mother, Helen." Helen blinked. "I know that now," Caroline said. "I didn't. Until just now I didn't. He was the man on the sidewalk. The morning he was late. He was the man." That same morning, Dorothy Ashford had decided she felt well enough to come see her daughter at work for the first time since Caroline had taken the chair. Her driver helped her out of the car at the front entrance at 10:30. Caroline came down to meet her in the lobby. They took the elevator up and walked the long hallway past the operations floor toward the executive wing. Halfway down the hallway, Dorothy stopped. There was a small employee recognition board on the wall, the kind every company has and nobody updates. The last quarter's honoree photograph had not been swapped out, because the person who had always updated it had been the one in the photograph. Daniel, in his navy jacket, standing beside the B-line conveyor with a torque wrench in one hand and a small, reluctant smile on his face. Dorothy put her hand flat against her chest. "Caroline, Mama? That is the man. That is the man who helped me." Caroline turned and looked at the photograph she had walked past every workday for 3 years and never seen. The pieces moved into place at the speed of light. The blue truck, the 47 minutes, the route past Forsyth Park, the blood on the cuff, the words "I need to get to work" spoken to a nurse at Memorial Health, the paramedic asking, "You medical?" The hands she had just watched move across a CPR mannequin in a community center. She had fired the man who saved her mother's life, in front of 40 people, and he had not said a single word. "Why didn't he tell you?" Dorothy asked. "Because I didn't let him." That afternoon, Caroline opened a second review. It took her the rest of the day and most of the next morning to assemble it. 3 other technicians had been let go in the past 18 months following the same pattern, the same shortened summary, the same Garrett signature. Each replacement contract had gone to Allied Industrial Services. The finance department, when she asked, traced ownership in 20 minutes. Derek Voss, brother-in-law to Garrett Voss, listed as co-owner of Allied. The estimated commission paid to Garrett through the arrangement, conservatively reconstructed from invoice spreads, was $185,000 over 18 months. Caroline closed her laptop, walked to her office window, and looked down at the empty parking space painted D. Whitaker. His badge was still on the corner of her desk. She had not been able to make herself move it. She picked it up now and turned it over. Taped to the back was a small school photograph of Emma, missing both front teeth, grinning at the camera. Caroline sat down in her chair and pressed the badge between her palms and did not move for a long time. Across town, Daniel was on the floor of his living room with Emma, putting together a 500-piece puzzle of the night sky. Emma had found 3 of the 4 corners. He found the 4th and slid it across the carpet to her without speaking. She fitted it into place and looked at him as if she had won something. He smiled at her. He did not yet know that an hour earlier his face had been recognized in a hallway at Ashford Logistics. The emergency board meeting convened on Friday morning at 9. Caroline laid the case out without theatrics. She presented the falsified summary reports. She presented the 18-month contract trail to Allied Industrial Services. She presented the ownership records connecting Derek Voss to Allied. She presented the operating cost analysis showing a $310,000 overrun attributable to the outsourcing pattern. She did not raise her voice once. Garrett went last. I streamlined operations. Every recommendation I made was inside policy. The CEO is using a single termination decision, which she made, to deflect from quarterly underperformance she has not been able to address. Raymond Holloway cleared his throat. This may be more appropriate as an HR matter. Caroline met his eyes across the table. A vice president using falsified personnel records to channel contracts to a family-owned vendor is not an HR matter. It is a governance failure. Raymond did not say anything else. The vote to terminate Garrett Voss for cause carried 7-2. Garrett stood up. He looked at Caroline and held the look long enough to mean something. Your father would never have done this. My father would never have needed to. He walked out. Caroline addressed the remaining board members briefly. She did not mention Daniel's medical background. That was not her information to share, she said. I terminated a competent employee based on incomplete information provided to me by a vice president who had a financial interest in his removal. That decision was mine. I take full responsibility for it. I am requesting authorization to restructure the maintenance department and create a new function for workplace wellness and community health programs. The vote on the restructuring was 9-0. That night, Caroline drove east on 38th Street, parked in front of 814, and knocked on Daniel's front door. He opened it. Behind him, in the kitchen, Emma sat at the table coloring. The light inside the house was yellow and quiet. I know what happened that morning. My mother told me. I read your real file. I know who you are. And I know I fired you in front of 40 people without asking you a single question. She had not planned the speech. I am not here to offer you your job back. I am here to tell you I am sorry. That is all. Daniel looked at her for a long time. The porch light moved a moth in a slow circle behind her head. How is she? Your mother. She's home. She's well. Because of you. Good. Another long pause. He did not invite her in. He did not close the door either. He stood in the open frame and let the night air do whatever it was going to do. Emma called from inside. Daddy, who is it? Daniel glanced over his shoulder and back. A friend, sweetheart. It was the first word, other than Miss Ashford, he had ever used to describe her. Caroline walked back to her car. He stood in the doorway. He did not wave. He did not close the door until she had started the engine. She drove 3 blocks before pulling over again. She sat with her forehead against the steering wheel for a full minute. Then she sat up, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and drove home. At the kitchen table, Emma looked up from her coloring book. Daddy? Who was that, really? A woman I used to work for. She looked sad. She had a hard day. Did you have a hard day? He thought about it. Not anymore. Emma nodded, satisfied in the way only an 8-year-old can be satisfied, and went back to her crayons. Daniel stood at the window for a long moment, watching the taillights of Caroline's car disappear down the street. 2 weeks later, Caroline called Daniel on the phone. She did not begin with an apology. She did not need to. She began with a problem. The new OSHA standards required hands-on first aid training for warehouse and operations staff, not a compliance video. Ashford Logistics needed someone to design the program. She was not offering him his old job back. She was offering him a 4-week consulting contract, billed at a professional rate. Daniel read the scope. He called her back 20 minutes later. Your people deserve real training, not a checked box. I'll do it. For 4 weeks they worked together in the small conference room on the 2nd floor and on the operations floor itself. Daniel designed the curriculum, taught the first round of certifications, and trained the floor leads to teach the rest. The workers on the floor saw a Daniel they had never seen. He spoke about stroke recognition and traumatic injury management with the calm authority of a man who had spent 10,000 hours in a trauma bay. Jerome stood at the back of the second session, arms folded, shaking his head slowly. 3 years, he said to no one in particular. 3 years I worked next to a damn doctor and didn't know. The interactions between Daniel and Caroline through that 4-week stretch followed no straight line. They began as email threads. They moved to 20-minute reviews. The reviews lengthened to 40. They ate lunch in the employee cafeteria because Daniel declined the executive dining room without comment. She started sitting one chair closer to him at conference tables. He started pouring her coffee without asking, black, no sugar, the way he had seen her drink it the first time. One Wednesday evening, after the rest of the team had left, Daniel stayed to box up the training mannequins. "She grew up here," he said without looking up. "Sarah, 2 blocks from where I live now. I moved Emma here because I wanted her to grow up where her mother had." Caroline was at the door. She turned back, but she did not move closer. "Some mornings I still make 2 cups of coffee before I remember." She did not say anything. She stood in the doorway and let him finish his work. In the 3rd week of the contract, Daniel invited Dorothy to a senior health screening event at the community center. She came in a navy cardigan and pearl earrings. Emma met her at the door with a crayon drawing of a sunflower. "Those are my favorites," Dorothy said. "Mine too. Daddy planted some in our yard." They sat together for an hour. The 8-year-old explained the names of every plant in the lobby's planter, and the 67-year-old listened with the patience of someone who had learned the long way that the small moments were the only ones that lasted. Across the room, Daniel and Caroline stood at the registration table, going over the next day's schedule. Caroline looked up at one point and saw her mother and Daniel's daughter side by side on a bench, heads bent over the drawing. She did not say anything to Daniel. She did not have to. The last day of the consulting contract was a Friday. Daniel stayed late to clean the conference room. Caroline came in around 6. "The contract ends today." "I know." He picked up his bag and walked toward her. The distance between his shoulder and the doorframe was less than a step. He stopped beside her, not facing her, looking down at the floor. "Thank you, Caroline." It was the first time he had said her name out loud. He walked out. For 2 weeks Daniel did not call, and Caroline did not call. In those 2 weeks Daniel went to the Midtown Free Clinic and asked to volunteer. He did not offer his license. He offered his hands. The clinic director, Dr. Ada Brooks, watched him work for 10 minutes and offered him a part-time consulting role designing a community screening program. He took it. Emma watched him at the kitchen table that night, surrounded by medical textbooks for the first time since they had moved to Savannah. "Are you going to be a doctor again, Daddy?" He looked up at her. He had been afraid of the question for 3 years. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but I think I'm done pretending I never was." She nodded as if this were obvious, and went back to her drawing. The call from Caroline came on a Tuesday morning at 8. Ashford Logistics wanted to create a director of health and community programs. The first aid curriculum Daniel had designed would become the model for the entire chain. The new function would partner with the Midtown Free Clinic. The director would report to the CEO. There would be no vice president layer. "I won't report through any VP, Daniel said. "There isn't one. You'd report to me." "I know." A long pause. "That's the part I'm still thinking about." He took 2 days. He sent the email on Thursday morning. "I'll start Monday. Send me the org chart." DW. 4 months after the morning on the sidewalk, Ashford Logistics and the Midtown Free Clinic co-sponsored a community health fair at Forsyth Park. Daniel had chosen the location himself. He had stood in Caroline's office a month earlier with the proposal in his hand and said, "That corner took something from your family. Let's put something back." Caroline had nodded without speaking. The day was clear and cool. Over 300 people came through. Daniel moved between booths with a clipboard he rarely looked at. Emma ran water bottles to volunteers, her hair in 2 braids he had tied that morning. Dorothy sat on a bench under a live oak, near the spot where she had fallen, and named every flower in the planter beside her. By late afternoon, the booths were closing down. Daniel sat on the wide stone steps at the edge of the park, his elbows on his knees, watching the sun go gold through the oaks. Caroline sat down beside him. She set an unopened bottle of water on the step between them. He picked it up, broke the seal, took a swallow, set it back down. Their shoulders were close enough that they could have been touching. They did not speak for a long time. Emma came running up the steps and climbed straight into Daniel's lap. She leaned her head against his chest and looked at Caroline. She looked at the space on the step between her father and the woman who had once been her father's boss. "You can sit closer. There's room." Daniel looked down at the top of his daughter's head and shook his head, faintly, but he did not say anything to her. Caroline shifted on the step. Not much, just enough that her shoulder rested against his. He did not move away. Across the lawn, Dorothy stood with her hand resting on the back of the bench. She watched the 3 of them on the steps for a long moment. She did not call out. She did not approach. She only smiled. When everything was loaded, Daniel stood beside the open driver's door of his father's blue truck. Emma was already buckled in. Caroline stood beside her own car across the lot. She looked at him. He looked at her. He did not wave. He inclined his head a half-inch. She inclined her head back. He got in the truck. She got in her car. They drove out of the lot in opposite directions, on streets that, in this city, eventually circled back to one another.